Thank you, Stephanie, and good morning, everyone. Is this the clicker?
Yes.
Terrific. This has a lot of interesting logos on it for future speakers. I think there's a, does that one work? Okay. The green one. Okay, thanks. I'm talking about issues of public and stakeholder engagement. As you know, GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, are controversial. I'm interested as a social scientist, what happens when biotechnology gets out of the lab, out of agricultural fields, out of big industrial fermenters, and into wild or unmanaged environments. And I think this has relevance for as we think about the future of fertility control for wildlife, and I think that will become apparent. I'll just mention that I'm part of the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University. Our mission is to integrate scientific knowledge and diverse public values in shaping the futures of biotechnology. And I'll be drawing on my experience working on a couple of expert committees over the last few years. I was on a National Academies committee looking at gene drives, which included social science and ethical perspectives, as well as looking at that technology as an emerging technology in 2016. I also served on another National Academies committee on forest health and biotechnology, and an IUCN task force on synthetic biology and biodiversity conservation. And it's important to note, so I'm a social scientist. What was I doing on these committees, right? This sounds like technology, ecology, modeling. But each of these committees recognize the importance of thinking about the social aspects of these technologies. And so that's what I'm drawing on for this presentation. So my experience on the Gene Drives Committee, I'll just mention some of the findings that we had around stakeholder and public engagement. First of all, that public engagement cannot be an afterthought. And I have to applaud this meeting's organizers. Look, I'm first. This never happens to me, ever. I'm always last. I come to conferences, and we talk about the technologies for several days, and at the very end, somebody says, well, the social part is important too. What do people think? And then I give my talk, and everybody goes home. We can't do that at conferences, and we also can't do that as we develop these technologies. And our National Academies Committee agreed with that. In fact, we said in 2016 that the outcomes of engagement may be as crucial as the scientific outcomes in terms of decisions about whether or how to release a gene drive modified organism into the environment. That's a big deal for a National Academies Committee to say, that the technology is not the only thing that matters. We defined engagement in that report, and I think this is a useful definition, which gets beyond just thinking about outreach and education. We define engagement as seeking and facilitating the sharing and exchange of knowledge, perspectives, and preferences between or among groups who often have differences in expertise, power, and values. There's a lot going on here. This is much more than simply raising public awareness about a technology that we think is a good idea. We also talked about the differences between engaging public, stakeholders, and communities. I think it's worthwhile thinking about the fact that we always construct publics or audiences when we do engagement. It's not a general public out there that exists independent of what we're doing. So why do we do engagement? Why do we think about this? And this, again, is from the National Academies report. First of all, that local knowledge really matters. So as scientific experts, we may develop a technology that we imagine would be useful, but applying it in different environments, and we just heard a talk about how one of the challenges is the range of organisms and environments that are active in this area. Local knowledge can be really important in terms of how we test and how we deploy these technologies. Second is principles of justice. These are, especially early on, experiments in unmanaged open environments that belong to all of us. So issues of transparency are really important. Informed consent comes from a kind of medical model of ethics. That doesn't quite work when we're talking about a shared environment where people can't opt in or out of an experiment. So we need to expand those kinds of concepts. There are also opportunities for mutual learning among the stakeholders, experts, communities, publics who are involved in these kinds of interactions. And hopefully, we're also building trust, that when we engage people with respect and thoughtfulness, we build trust with people that matters over time as we engage them further and try to make decisions together. But of course, there are challenges of engagement. So there's a number of key questions that I think about as a social scientist. First of all, who should be engaged? That's not obvious. And we don't always approach that question thoughtfully ahead of time. Second, what are the goals of engagement? We can imagine engaging people for many different reasons, and if we're not explicit about why we're doing it, we're not likely to succeed in that activity. Third, when should engagement occur? So there's certainly concern about engaging too early or too late. Finding that right balance seems important. We want to recognize that cultural differences across those who are doing the engaging and those who are being engaged are really important and tricky to manage. And I think if we think about wild environments and doing wildlife fertility control, that's certainly an important issue. What are potential triggers for polarization? So if there are some stakeholders who already have strong opinions one way or the other, how can we do engagement that doesn't just push people more fully into the camps where they're coming from? And this is really important. What happens when we do engagement? How do we feed those results into real decision making? Let's not do engagement because it looks good or we're supposed to do it. Let's do it because it matters. And that means that we have to think ahead of time about how to incorporate the outputs of engagement into real decision making. And so now I want to turn away from the kind of theory of a social scientist thinking about engagement in the abstract. I'm also a practitioner. So I care about doing this well, and I do experiments in engagement to try to do it better and to try to learn from my experience. And I'm going to draw on my work with an international partnership, the Genetic Biocontrol of Invasive Rodents Program. I won't talk about the technology, but we're interested in gene-drive mice to eradicate invasive mice on islands to protect biodiversity. And for those of you interested in that project, Tony Piaggio, will you raise your hand? Where's Tony? She's over there. Is going to talk about our project from the scientific point of view, I think, later today? Yes, okay. So I've been a social scientist in this partnership since almost the beginning. We were part of a DARPA Safe Genes grant, and I was able to do social science research around our project well before we had a mouse. We still don't have a mouse, but we're doing engagement. We started by doing a landscape analysis of stakeholders across the world. Experts interviewed to try to understand what are the different perspectives and values and concerns around this potential technology. And then we moved into a more interactive engagement, a stakeholder workshop that we held at NC State in 2019 that I'll talk just a little bit about today. So firstly, it was really important that we invited quite a diversity of participants. So these were scientists from the project, the innovators working in the labs on the molecular biology, the modelers, other ecologists, but also people that we hadn't interacted with yet. Conservation NGOs, animal welfare experts. We tried to get a diversity of people in the room for this conversation. And the kinds of things we talked about over a couple of days ranged from the laboratory research that's happening right now in terms of what gene drive mechanisms we're considering, the control methods, also talking about how might we test this technology in the future if and when we get a mouse. What kind of testing would be appropriate? What kind of safety do we need in place? How does this work even in terms of selecting the first island where this might be trialed? We talked about these different issues with this diversity of experts and the people in the partnership to have productive conversations and to learn from one another. One of the exercises that we did that you don't have to read this table, that's not important, but we did an island scenario exercise. One of the big challenges for the G-BIRD program is if we're able to develop a mouse and we want to test it sometime, how do we select that first island? How do we find a place where it's most appropriate to run a field trial of what will be a very controversial technology? We don't have islands picked out yet, so we couldn't simply present the stakeholders with a list of 6 and say, which one should we choose? We're at the stage of thinking about criteria and trade-offs and priorities. And so what we did was we created a number of island scenarios to talk about the kinds of criteria that might be out there, and then we organized discussions among these stakeholders so that they had to wrestle with how they would manage the trade-offs that might exist. And this was a really fun exercise for the workshop, and I'm actually running it here tomorrow for you all. As a way to show how this works and also for the G-BIRD partnership to learn more about what another diverse group of stakeholders might think about this challenge of selecting an island for a field trial. So I welcome you to come to that event tomorrow afternoon. So what did we learn from doing this workshop? I'll just mention a couple of things. First of all, the people who came to this workshop were really enthusiastic about being engaged upstream upstream from the final development of the technology. So we didn't convene a group of people and put the mouse in front of them and say, look what we have, this is awesome, we love it, will you get on board? Instead, we came to them and had conversations with them well before all of the technical details are figured out, well before we had the full design, even before we had done the safety testing. And they appreciated being consulted and part of conversations before we had it all figured out. Second was the people who came to our workshop were really appreciative of working with developers who weren't fully committed. So one of the neat things about the GBIRD partnership is that we have scientists who are really interested in exploring gene drive for this problem, but we're not all sure that it's the right thing to do. We're not all sure that the balance of risks and benefits mean we should go forward with this technology in any particular way. And so the stakeholders that came, again, were appreciative of working with scientists who had concerns and had doubts and were willing to talk about those openly in a somewhat public meeting. I talked a little bit about the value of scenarios and how that helps us integrate facts and values in conversations and to force us to talk about the kinds of trade-offs and priorities that we'll have to wrestle with when things can't be perfect and we can't just design an ideal island somewhere out there. Some of the concerns that were raised by participants, however, it's difficult to talk about technical options when we haven't already done safety studies. So how do we wrestle with trade-offs of risks and benefits when we don't know the answers, the scientific answers to what those risks and benefits are exactly? It's possible that a focus on new tools could undermine existing strategies. So our NGO partner, Island Conservation, is already doing eradication of invasive species on islands, including rodents, using conventional toxicants. If we are promoting conversations like this, do we undermine support for that kind of work? And lastly, that there is a tension between being seen as working for public acceptance and being what we think of as an honest broker to foster real conversations about how and whether we should move forward with these technologies. I'll just mention that our workshop report is available free on our Genetic Engineering and Society website. These are some of my collaborators, including Katie Barnhill-Dilling, who's in the audience. Will you raise your hand? So Katie helped organize that workshop, and we'll be working together tomorrow as well in the exercise. And I also just want to mention, this is more for conversation at the conference if you want to talk to me. I've also been involved in a project around the genetically engineered American chestnut tree. So that's another really interesting example of using biotechnology to restore a species that is functionally extinct. That technology is currently under regulatory review. The field testing has already happened, and there are big questions about whether the US government is going to approve of this technology being released. As a social scientist, I ran a project funded by the National Science Foundation to think about the social and political aspects of this technology. Again, we also organized a workshop with the scientists who developed this tree and a number of different stakeholders, and we had conversations about how we need to think about the kind of engagement of stakeholders and publics that would need to happen if this technology is approved. Because it's not just the decision about whether it's approved by the regulatory agencies, it's also a decision about where might this be planted? How would we manage this tree? How would we monitor this tree? Who would be involved? For how long? What are the criteria for success? And so those are the kinds of decisions that I think can be influenced by stakeholder and public engagement in important ways. And I'll also just mention, these are some of the publications that came out of this grant. I want to highlight one of the aspects of this project was that we were intentionally engaging some Native American groups. So again, Katie Barnhill-Dilling, my colleague, did work of interviewing indigenous people in the Haudenosaunee area because their current and historic lands overlap with the range of the American chestnut, and they are also co-located in the area where field trials have already been done with the genetically engineered American chestnut. And so if we think about, one of the complexities of this technology and maybe others that we would consider is that if we release biotechnology into wild, unmanaged environments, it's not going to stay put. It's going to move around, and it will cross political boundaries that include national boundaries and also sovereign tribal boundaries. And so that seems to be an important way that we think about engagement. And I will end there with 7 seconds left.